Very well then, welcome to the very first lecture in Religion 3367, Islamic Faith and Society. This is the spring semester 2023 at FIU, Florida International University. Today is January 13th, Friday, January 13th, 2023. Friday the 13th, I hope that's not an inauspicious date to begin. These lectures really should have commenced on the 10th and the 12th, I think, of this month. But as you know, there were certain technical difficulties, so we are a little bit behind, but we will catch up very quickly, and we'll be back on schedule in terms of recording these lectures. So I would like to speak briefly, address the course in general and course policies in this first lecture, and then we will begin our discussion of the very first chapter in our textbook. But before we go any further, let's just talk about the course and the course policies. This course is designed to really introduce Islam as a religion, as a culture, as a civilization to complete beginners. Obviously, it's an undergraduate course. And the very first part of the course is the most important. By the first part, I mean the first 5 weeks, which will cover chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 from our textbook. That's really the Islamic faith portion. The next portion will look at dimensions of Islamic society and civilization in the past. And then the last part of the course will deal with Islam and the West, Islam and the modern world. Our textbook is entitled A New Introduction to Islam. We're using the 3rd edition. This book is by Daniel W. Brown. It's a fair question to ask, who Daniel W. Brown is. If you actually search him on the internet, you do find some interesting information. I should say that I, at the moment, only have an electronic version, an ebook version of this textbook. I used to have a hardcover copy, but that was of the 1st edition. We're using the 3rd edition, and I have since gotten rid of my earlier edition. And so I imagine if I had the hardcover edition, I'd be able to find some information about the author on the back. But I couldn't find anything in the electronic edition. But if you actually search online, you will find a biographical entry for Daniel W. Brown from Wikipedia. It says Daniel W. Brown is the author of the books A New Introduction to Islam in its 3rd edition as of 2017. Then he has another book called Rethinking Tradition in Modern Islamic Thought that came out in 1991. It says he's got another book in the pipeline, and then he's written another scholarly work on Islam. But I couldn't find his institutional affiliation anywhere except on this Wikipedia page. So it seems that he is the director of the Institute for the Study of Religion in the Middle East, ISRME, which is in Istanbul, Turkey. If you search about him there and find the ISRME website, which is under isrme.org, you find that he spent a lot of time in Pakistan. Apparently he lived there for about 18 years, and he says here that he actually knows Arabic, Turkish, and Urdu. All right, well, whatever the case may be, I like this book for a few reasons, and I also dislike it for a few reasons. So the plus points of Daniel Brown's book are that it really covers a huge amount of material in a manageable space of, in a manageable number of chapters and words. And another aspect is that the book doesn't really oversimplify things like many introductory works on Islam do, by which I mean that the scholarly study of Islam in the Western world, in Western academia, particularly in Anglophone academia, meaning research and scholarship which is published in English language publications in the English-speaking world, the whole field is very vast, of course, but there is a fair amount of disagreement on some key issues in Islamic history, as well as other dimensions of the Islamic religion and the scholarly study of the Islamic religion. And Brown doesn't shy away from those controversies. He tries to give the reader some glimpses of these scholarly controversies, which I think are important and significant. At the same time, he also is acutely aware of the fact that Islam is a very complex phenomenon. Mind you, there's 15 centuries of history, and at this point in time in 2023, Muslims have spread all over the world. I don't think there's any country in the world where you don't find some Muslims. You might find more in one place and less in another, but Islam has spread all over the world, so it's very complex. The way that Muslims live their lives, for example, in the United States is very different in many ways from the way Muslims might live their lives in Xinjiang in China. Yes, there are Muslims in China, in case you didn't know. Or the way that Muslims live their lives, let's say, in South Africa. So he tries to look at all of these dimensions, and there's also a vast amount of variation among Muslims in terms of how they even understand their faith. There are different kinds of Muslims, just as there are different kinds of Christians. So to give you an example from Christianity, there's really a world of difference between, let's say, a Greek Orthodox Christian and an evangelical Christian from the rural United States. So similarly, there is a lot of variation among Muslims. There are different kinds of Muslims, and we will get into all of this. And for that purpose, the book is quite good. Some of the drawbacks of the book are, because he's really trying to do so much, there are some mistakes, I would say, and also some sort of superficialities and superficial representations of things. And I will do my best to point all of that out as we go through the book. So this is the key text for this class. I may refer you to maybe some online sources and so forth in the lectures, but I really am not going to expect you to be responsible for having any other textbook or any other reading. If there's some really interesting thing that we come across in the coming weeks, elsewhere, let's say on the web or in some other form, I'll make it available to you, and I will make it clear whether you're responsible for that on the exam or not. But essentially, you are responsible for the textbook and the readings which are mentioned in the syllabus, as well as anything and everything which is said in the lectures. So if you keep on top of these recorded lectures and you keep on top of your readings, you will be fine. In terms of the reading, if you notice on the syllabus, in the first 5 weeks, we are covering chapters 1 through 6. Then we're going to skip chapters 7 and 8. We can't do everything. And then we will focus in the second part of the course on chapters 9 through 12. Then we'll have our second test in the 11th week. Our first test will be in the 6th week. And then we will skip 13 and 14, and we will cover chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18. And so that last few weeks of the course really looks at Islam and its confrontation with the modern world, Islam and its encounter with the modern world, Islam and its encounter with the West in both the 20th century as well as this very young, still young 21st century. And we will look at a very important phenomenon known as Salafism as well. Each of these tests, so there's only 2 tests, They're each 30 points. That adds up to 60 points. And then the comprehensive final, comprehensive meaning covering everything, will be 40 points. So that adds up to 100 points. Very straightforward, very easy to grade, very easy for you to keep track of your standing in the course. Excuse me. All right. So if you have any questions, you can, of course, email me. I am very happy to take questions. I am also available if anybody needs to speak to me live. We can set up a Zoom session. Email me about that. So that would be by appointment. And if there's more than one of you that want to meet me and we can coordinate, that's also possible. Otherwise, I don't mind setting things up any other way. If anybody wants to have a live session sometime for Q&A, that's also possible. I currently do not live in Miami. I am living actually in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So I am an hour behind Miami. Miami is on Eastern Standard Time. I'm on Central Standard Time, so keep that in mind. But if anybody does want to set up some sort of a live meeting, that's also possible. Get in touch with me by email if you want to do that. So let's just jump right in. Like I said, there's a lot about this book which I like. It also has some very good maps. There's some very good photos and pictures here as well. A lot of illustrations, charts, maps, which are very, very useful. And another very good aspect of this book is at the end of each chapter, he provides questions for review. I'm not going to be assigning those, but they are a useful means for you to check your own understanding. They're a useful index, if you like, for you to measure your understanding of the chapter. And I would recommend that before you read any chapter, you look at those questions first. You might even jot them down in your notebook and try and keep those questions in your mind as you read the textbook and attempt to answer them. So it's important to read carefully and to read with good comprehension. And there's nothing wrong with jotting down important points, taking notes. If you have a hard copy of the book, some people like to write in their book, jot notes in their book. If you have an e-version, there's things you can highlight there as well electronically. But I think it's very important to keep a notebook with very good notes in it, and you should do the same on these lectures. You do have the advantage that they are recorded, so you can go back and listen to them more than once, rewind, etc. So much for that. Now, what I would like to look at when we look at the very first chapter, which is entitled Islam in Global Perspective, he begins this chapter with the question, really, of explaining or defining what is meant by Islam. So he's really trying to answer this very fundamental question, what is Islam? Then he proceeds to approach the question of where is Islam, if we may put it that way. In other words, where do we find Muslims? Where do we find adherents of this religion? Then he looks at the relationship of Arabs and the Arabic language to Islam. Then he moves to differences and divisions among Muslims. Then he concludes by an example of the unity in diversity, which you find in Islam. And that example of unity in diversity, what sort of unites together all Muslims, is a kind of unifying element in the rituals of this religion. And then he concludes the chapter, as he does every chapter, with resources for further reading. Those are optional. I hope that this course generates some curiosity, some interest, and there's plenty of suggestions for further reading and study at the end of every chapter, which each of you is free to follow up on. So let's get into it. Islam in global perspective. What is Islam? Well, Islam is a religion in the first instance, but it's also a civilization, much more so, I would say, than other religions which most Americans would be familiar with, namely Judaism or Christianity. And the reason is that in the history of Islam, it became really a world civilization. In fact, I would argue that Islam really was the first global civilization. And the effects of that global civilization are still with us today, even after the demise of these major Muslim empires. The last great Muslim empire to end was the Ottoman Empire. It was one of the three so-called gunpowder empires. Gunpowder empire meaning, empires which made it into the age of guns, gunpowder, modern warfare. So the Ottoman Empire ended in the early part of the 20th century, sometime in the I don't remember the exact. It depends on how you actually want to say or mark the ending, but it's in, let's say, in the 1920s, mid 1920s. Some people might put it a little bit later, when the last emperor went into exile, but it doesn't really matter. It basically makes it to the 20th century. The other great, gunpowder empires, as they're called, are the Safavid Empire, which was more or less in what is today Iran, but included other parts of the Islamic world. And then there was what is generally known as the Mughal Empire in India. If you've heard of the Taj Mahal, that's a great architectural monument of that empire or civilization. So Islam was a very complex phenomenon, and even now the effects of this sort of unifying world civilization or global civilization are still there, in as much as Muslims still have a great deal in common. I mean, if you were to go to Istanbul, which is in Turkey, and then if you were to go to, let's say, Fez, which is in Morocco, and then if you were then to hop on over to, let's say, Kashgar, which is in a western region of what is claimed by China and in Chinese is referred to as Xinjiang, but which the local inhabitants call Eastern Turkestan, you would find a lot of elements in common. And you would find the same if you even went to Indonesia. You would find the same if you went into a mosque in New Jersey or even in Miami. You would find things in common. So there is still a kind of civilization of Muslim culture, which has a sort of global reach. Islam is also very much in the media, very much in the news. The events which took place on September 11th in the year, was it 2001, I think? Yes. Are also seared into the collective consciousness of the whole world, and are associated with people at least who claimed to be Muslim. So it's a very, very complicated phenomenon. How do we deal with it? There are all sorts of people who claim to be Muslims. The Muslims in Iran are very different from the Muslims in what is Saudi Arabia. In Iran, you have what are called Shia Muslims. They are a minority among Muslims. Are they also Muslims? There are many Sunnis who don't consider the Shia to be Muslims. There are people in Afghanistan who call themselves the Taliban, and they have certain views regarding women, for example. At the same time, you have in the United States an American Muslim woman scholar who is of African American descent named Amina Wadud, and she calls herself, I don't know if she actually calls herself, but my guess is that she would more than likely deem herself to be a Muslim feminist. Certainly others would classify her as a Muslim feminist. So is she also a Muslim? Is she also an adherent of Islam, just like Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, is an adherent of Islam? Can we really say all these people are Muslims? There are people who call themselves the Ismailis. And they have certain very distinct doctrines. I don't want to get into too much details. Are they, at this point, it's not really productive to get into these details, but we will. Are they Muslims? Many Muslims don't consider them. There's a large group of Muslims who don't consider them to be Muslims. So these are the kind of examples that Daniel Brown gives in the beginning. And so there are those who would argue that, well, instead of talking about Islam with a capital I, we really need to talk about Islam with a lowercase I. Daniel Brown rejects this approach. I agree with him here. I don't think that is the way to go about it. I don't think that there is an Indonesian Islam which is completely different, from, let's say, an Egyptian Islam, small I. So I don't agree with this. And the example that he gives is an interesting one. Sorry, not the example, but he tries to make the reader understand by way of analogy that, if you take a language like Arabic, and Arabic is a good example, there's a lot of different forms of the Arabic language. So there is a classical form of Arabic, and this classical form is more or less observed in written Arabic and in formal situations. And a formal situation would include, let's say, a news broadcast in Arabic. So one of the most famous news channels, like the CNN of Arabic or the BBC of Arabic, is called Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera also transmits in English I think they even have a Spanish version, but they originally started out as an Arabic news channel. So the Arabic that they speak there is classical Arabic. But there's all these other kinds of Arabic. So when Arabs actually speak, especially in informal situations, it's very different from country to country, from region to region, and even within a country from place to place, from village to village, from city to city, from town to town. And in this regard, Arabic is very much like Spanish. If any of you live in Miami, then you obviously have exposure to the Spanish language. But there's more than one kind of Spanish. There's Puerto Rican Spanish, right? There's Mexican Spanish. There's the Spanish, I guess, the Spanish of Spain. There's the Spanish that they speak in Honduras or Cuba or elsewhere. And I know that they sound very different, but people are able to understand each other. So the same is true in the Arabic language. You have all sorts of different dialects, and they are extremely different, yet people are able to understand one another. That may surprise you, but for example, in classical Arabic, one way that you would say to a person, what do you want? Let's say it's one person and it's male, because it'll be different if it's masculine or feminine. You would say, Mada turid. But somebody from Saudi Arabia would say, especially from the Hijaz, he would say, Ishtibgha. Someone from the Levant, from Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, probably would say something like, Shubiddak, and so on. So these things, obviously, they sound very different, but they're all Arabic. And so similarly, there is a kind of constant sort of core which is recognizable as Islam all over the world. And so for this reason, he says this is how he's going to approach the subject in the book. He's not going to talk about, say, a Turkish Islam as opposed to a Nigerian Islam, for example. In terms of where you find Muslims, that's under the heading Mapping the Islamic World. He has a very interesting map. It's map 1, distribution of the Muslim population by country. Now, it is true that Muslims are concentrated in Asia, but there are huge numbers of Muslims now that live outside of Asia. Now, you might say, well, no, what about the Middle East? Well, this is something which people say in America, the Middle East. The Middle East, really, strictly speaking, is the western region of Asia, and it's in much of the world outside of the U.S., they don't speak of the Middle East. They talk about West Asia. And in the U.S., they always also talk about the MENA region, MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. But generally speaking, it's West Asia. And then you would have much of Africa, especially Northern Africa. So Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, so-called North Africa, that's Muslim. Also, much of the immediately outside of that region, the so-called sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of Muslim countries there as well. But the interesting thing is that there are more Muslims. Well, let me put it this way. I wonder how many of you know what the most populous Muslim country is in the world. Think about that for a moment. You can even Google it if you want. The country with the largest population in the Muslim world is Indonesia. A lot of people are surprised when they hear that. I have never been to Indonesia, but I have been to Malaysia, and I lived for a number of years in Malaysia, in fact. And it is a majority Muslim country. There's a lot more Muslims in Indonesia than in Malaysia, and they are culturally and linguistically very closely related peoples. But what about India? If you think about India, India is generally not considered a Muslim country. Rightly so, it isn't. It's not in so-called Middle East or West Asia. It is in Asia. But how many Muslims do you think live in India? There are no less than 200 million Muslims in India. That's more Muslims than in the entire Arab world. And we'll talk more about Arabs and Islam, but Islam is often considered to be an Arab religion. But think about that for a moment. You have the country of India, and just India, not if you include Pakistan and Bangladesh, which is very much one cultural sort of space. Northern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. If you included that, the number would be even larger, because Bangladesh is a majority Muslim country. Pakistan is a majority Muslim country. So think about this. In that one country of India, there's at least 200 million Muslims. That's more Muslims than in the entire Arab world. That's more Muslims than you find in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait. I think I've covered all the Arab countries. Maybe Djibouti is considered an Arab country. I don't know if they're in the Arab League. Maybe even Somalia. A lot of people in Somalia speak Arabic. So anyhow, but that's a huge area. There's more Muslims in India. There are also very significant populations of Muslims in Europe. There are Muslim countries in Europe. Bosnia is a Muslim country in Europe. Albania is a Muslim country in Europe. Kosovo is a country. It's not recognized by many other countries, but let's leave that to the to the United Nations to figure out. Kosovo is if not a country, a Muslim political entity recognized by some countries and not recognized by others in Europe. You find significant minority Muslim populations in the United Kingdom, in France. You find a significant population of Muslims in the United States, especially in Chicago, especially in the New York, New Jersey area. And now increasingly, more and more Muslims are moving to the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. You will also find a lot of Muslims in California, especially in Los Angeles. So Islam now has become a kind of global phenomenon. Now, it's true there are pockets where you're not going to find a lot of Muslims. Like in the U.S., I don't think you're going to find any significant concentration of Muslims in, Alaska. I don't think you're going to find a lot of Muslims in northern Canada or Greenland. Um, I don't think you're going to find much of anybody, Muslims, Christian, Jews, Buddhists, or anybody in Antarctica. You will find a lot of Muslims in, let's say, Australia, certain parts of Australia, certain cities there. New Zealand. There are now even, not insignificant pockets of Muslims, even in Japan, Korea, and so forth. So Islam has become very much this kind of a global phenomenon. But I would argue that this is not really something new. It is in terms of Muslim populations in Europe, but the different Muslim empires, you have to understand, even in the classical period, they spanned, let's say as early as, well, about even 900 years ago, even 1,000 years ago. You had Muslims between what is today Morocco all the way to India. And indeed, there were parts of the world which were completely Muslimized, Islamized, which no longer are. Daniel Brown doesn't mention this, but Muslims were in Spain and ruled major parts of Spain for about 8 centuries. Muslims ruled Sicily for about 200 years. A lot of people are not aware of this or have forgotten, or it's not widely known. But it needs to be emphasized. So how about Arabs, non-Arabs? This is an interesting question. So if I've already made the point that the majority of Muslims in the world are not Arab, why this big emphasis on Arabic in the Islamic religion? Well, it so happens that the language of Islam, both as a religion and for centuries as a civilization, was Arabic. And as a religious language, as a liturgical language, as a language in which Muslims pray and perform other ritual acts, Arabic is still central. So there are a number of religious duties that a Muslim has, and the most important is prayer. Now, you have to understand that this is a highly formalized and ritualized form of prayer. It's not something like you find especially in evangelical churches where people are just standing and saying, "Oh God, give me this," and "Oh God," and "Oh Jesus," or something like that. It's a very formalized ritual act that has rules. It has timings. Muslims pray 5 times a day. They face in the direction of Mecca, and they have certain postures that involve standing up straight, then bowing down slightly, and then going all the way down to the ground and pressing their forehead and their hands and their feet in a position of prostration, and their knees in the direction of Mecca. And there's a set sequence of those that is done. And there are certain passages which are recited in that from the Quran. And the Quran is the scripture of the Muslims. It's considered by all Muslims to be the revealed word of God, the literal speech of God himself. And it is in the Arabic language. So these prayers have to be said in Arabic. You don't have an option. You have to learn the prayers in Arabic. So everyone from an early age memorizes portions of the Quran. So that's another thing. It's got to be memorized. You can't be reading out from a book. And because of the centrality of the Quran as the religious scripture of the Muslims, Arabic became the learned language of the religion. And so all important works were written in Arabic. And a huge sort of range of disciplines emerged after the revelation of the Quran. And a huge amount of literature was produced in the Arabic language. So Arabic is absolutely central. Another important dimension of the Islamic religion has to do with what are called the hadith. And we'll do a whole chapter on that. We'll do a whole chapter on the Quran as well. The hadith are, let's just keep it simple at this stage, They're basically just statements or descriptions of things that the Prophet Muhammad, who is the prophet of the Muslims, to whom the Quran was revealed according to the belief of the Muslims. So these are his statements and accounts of his life, and there are a lot of them. It's a huge body of literature. That all of that is also in Arabic. And so the other sort of rituals that Muslims do also are mostly in Arabic. If a Muslim has a particular kind of request or a particular kind of supplication which they want to address to God, that doesn't necessarily have to be in Arabic, but the 5 daily prayers must be in Arabic. This kind of supplication, which in Arabic is called dua, does not have to be in Arabic. It could be in the person's native language, but even there, many people like to do that in Arabic, and the reason for that is because there are certain set formulae and certain set supplications which have come down to our time in the hadith or the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and many Muslims like to follow that. So I think I was going to make another point about this global nature of Islam and how that is not really something unique to modern times. If you look in Islamic history, there was a famous traveler. He's sort of like a Marco Polo figure, and his name was Ibn Battuta. And he was from Morocco, and he traveled all over the Muslim world. He, in fact, went as far as India and China. And everywhere he went, he was well received, and he found Muslims, and he found employment, which is really interesting. He even lived in India for a while and worked as a judge because he was trained in Islamic law. So the fact that a guy from Morocco could go to Delhi and have no problem being a Muslim judge there is very interesting. So there was this sort of cultural homogeneity or a kind of global dimension to the Islamic civilization even then. So there are other kinds of Muslims. There's a variety of Muslims, and the most important sort of division is between the Sunnis and the Shiites. I'm just going to read out what Daniel Brown says here under Sunnis and Shiites in chapter 1. He says, there is more to the diversity of Islam than language, culture, and geography. In fact, a major sectarian fault line splits the Muslim world. Roughly 80% of Muslims identify themselves as Sunnis, and about 18, 19, 20%, he sticks with 18, about 18% call themselves Shiites. So what is the difference? The difference between Muslims, Sunni and Shia, is a very important division which took place in Islamic history, and it really has to do with two very different understandings of the nature of authority. And in terms of authority, I mean both religious and political. You have to understand that the idea of the sacred and the secular, a kind of division between religion and the state, is very much a modern concept. It's very much a modern concept. And you don't really have this before modern times. And that's certainly true in the Islamic world as well. So the question is, what happens after the death of the Prophet Muhammad? So the Prophet Muhammad was born in the year, either in the year 570 or 571. We don't have an exact date for his birth in terms of the calendar that we use today. We have an approximation, and then you have to convert, and so it's about 570 or 571. And we definitely know when he died. He died in the year 632. So when he dies in 632, what happens? While he's alive, there's no question regarding the spiritual and temporal authority. The religious and the political leadership is all invested in him. What happens when he dies? This is the origin of the Sunni-Shia split. The Shia are of the view that the Prophet Muhammad, in his own lifetime, explicitly designated a successor, an individual to whom his spiritual and temporal authority would fall upon after his death. The Sunnis claim that no such designation was made. And in fact, this question was left up to the community to resolve by appointing someone. So the Shia say that the person whom they claim was explicitly designated by the Prophet Muhammad was his cousin, whose name is Ali, or Ali ibn Abi Talib. And this figure, Ali ibn Abi Talib, also happened to be the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, because he was the husband of the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, also known as Fatimatu Zahra. The second part of her name means the luminous or the flourishing. And then the Shia claim that the authority, both spiritual and temporal, of the Prophet continues in that bloodline, the bloodline of Ali and Fatima, and that after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, after the death of Prophet Muhammad, it goes to Ali. Then after the death of Ali, it would go to Ali's eldest son, who was known as Hassan or Al-Hassan. And that after the death of Hassan, it went to his next son, which is Hassan's younger brother, Hussein. And then they claim that the lineage, that the leadership or the spiritual and temporal authority continues in the bloodline of Hussein. The Sunni Muslims claim that there was no such designation, and that the question of who should assume this mantle of the Prophet, namely the mantle of his spiritual and temporal authority, was something which the community would themselves decide through some means of deliberation, through some means of consultation. However, there is no democracy here in any modern sense. There wasn't any kind of vote. A lot of modern Muslims speak about how there was some sort of a vote, or that Islam recognizes democracy. These are other debates to have, but certainly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there was nothing like parliamentary democracy or some sort of a universal suffrage, and everybody voted and they counted the ballots, and the person whom the Sunnis claim became the successor to the Prophet's authority, namely someone named Abu Bakr, who was a close follower and companion of the Prophet Muhammad. He's known as Abu Bakr. And then he was in power only for a couple of years, and then he appointed, and there was no shura, there was no consultation. Shura is the word for consultation in Arabic. He appointed, before he died, his own successor, who would be Umar, someone named Umar or Umar ibn al-Khattab, and this is how it went. And so after Umar, Umar was assassinated, but before he died, before he succumbed to his wounds by an assassin, he appointed a committee, and he told the committee, gave instructions that his successor would be chosen among the committee members. And this is how it went. So then Uthman comes to power, and then he also dies an unnatural death. And then he doesn't die a natural death. He's also the result of a kind of assassination. And we'll go into all of this later in the course. And then finally, the person whom the Shia claim should have been the successor from the beginning, he then assumes power. Again, that would be Ali. So these four individuals for the Sunni Muslims are called the four rightly guided caliphs. Caliph is an anglicization, Caliph, of the Arabic word khalifa, which means successor. And this debate has many, many other dimensions, which entered into the whole equation, shall we say, with the passage of time. And we will look at these things as the course progresses. But that is the major division among Muslims, and it is a very important one. and it has become more and more pronounced in recent years due to various political events. Again, we'll get into all of this later. All right, having said all of that, at the same time, there is a tremendous amount of unity among Muslims. So you might think, well, how is that possible? What you have to do is you cannot think in Christian terms. You cannot think in Jewish terms. You have to approach the subject on its own terms. When I say you can't think in Christian terms, it's nothing like the division between, let's say, Catholics and Protestants. So that division comes out because of something called the Protestant Reformation. There was a very important figure named Martin Luther. These are well-known figures and events. So there were no such analogous events in Islamic history. So it's not like the division between Catholics and Protestants. It's also not like the division between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And then even in the Orthodox, you have their little divisions. But, there's Greek Orthodox, there's Russian Orthodox. Now, because of what's happening in Ukraine, there's the Ukrainian Orthodox is probably going to separate or already has from the Russian Orthodox. There's Serbian Orthodox. There's Egyptian Orthodox, which is usually called Coptic. There's Abyssinian Orthodox. In Ethiopia, they have their own sort of understanding of Christianity as well. So there are all of these divisions, but it's nothing like any of that. And the reason is that there's a huge difference. If you walk into a Catholic church on Sunday, you're going to see things which are very different from what you would find in, let's say, a Baptist church, an evangelical church, a Pentecostal church. And it's going to be very different from what you would find, let's say, in Moscow at a Russian Orthodox church, or in an Abyssinian, in an Ethiopian Orthodox church. I've visited these different denominations and seen it's very, very different. Do you think you would see the same sort of radical differences if you went to a Sunni mosque and a Shia mosque? And the answer is no. So first of all, Shia and Sunni Muslims have exactly the same Quran. They have no difference. All Muslims recite the same Quran in Arabic. All right. You pick up a Catholic Bible and you pick up a Protestant Bible, they're going to be quite different. In the sense that the Protestants recognize that the Bible consists of 66 books. The Catholics have 78 because they include something called the Apocrypha, and there's also a reason in the difference is because some of the denominations divide the existing books differently. And moreover, there's going to be further differences with the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible. But right now, we're only talking about the Christians. If you go to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, I think they have 81 books in their Bible because they include something called the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, and I think there's another book. And the languages are also different. So for the Catholics, the preferred version of the Bible is in Latin. Even though the original scriptures in what's called the Hebrew Bible, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, is in Hebrew, except for two major portions in Aramaic. But they prefer to have it in Latin because there's a translation called the Vulgate or the Vulgata by St. Jerome. All of the Orthodox churches base themselves off of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, plus the New Testament, which is in Greek. And then, depending on which version of Orthodoxy they adhere to, they often prefer their own language. So in Eastern Europe, Russia, it's Old Church Slavonic, if I'm not mistaken. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's the classical Ethiopic language of Ge'ez. All right, and then if you go to these Protestant churches, they use whatever vernacular. In Germany it'll be German, in Armenia it'll be Armenian. What have you. This is not the case with the Quran. There are translations. There's nothing wrong with that. There are translations, but the Quran is always in the original language, and it's the same. If you buy a Quran printed, in Iran, it will be the same as the Quran printed in Saudi Arabia. Now the thing is that the Quran is an oral phenomenon. It is first and foremost an oral text, and there are different ways of reciting the Quran. And again, this is something on which Muslims do not disagree. So it is possible, if you go to Morocco, the printed Quran that you will get there will not exactly word for word look 100% like the Quran, which is printed, let's say, in Saudi Arabia or in Iran, because they adhere in their day-to-day prayers to one particular way of reciting the Quran. So there are different ways of reciting the Quran, and there's only so many ways that you can visually represent them and write them down. But there's no disagreement among Muslims about these different ways of reciting the Quran. So it's exactly the same. Not an issue. All Muslims pray 5 times a day. There might be some variations among Sunni and Shiites on very small minor details, but they all pray 5 times a day. They all pray in the direction of Mecca. All Muslims fast during the daylight hours for 1 lunar month every year, which is known as the month of Ramadan. Sunnis and Shiites, they do it. All Muslims are required to give a certain amount of their wealth every year, of certain kinds of wealth, 2.5% on certain kinds of wealth. Every year it's called the zakat, as alms, as charity. Sunnis and Shias, all Muslims do this. All Muslims are required to go on the pilgrimage to Mecca, where Islam began, which is in the Arabian Peninsula. Sunnis and Shias do this. So they have the same ritual obligation. So ritual and the ultimate core of belief, because all Muslims believe in Allah, which is the Arabic word for God, and they believe that He is utterly unique. So it's an uncompromising and absolute monotheism. They believe that this God, this one and only God, sends prophets and messengers, and so they believe that He communicates His will to human beings, and that there have been previous revelations, that the final revelation is the Quran. They believe that everyone will die, and they will be resurrected one day, that the world as we know it, the universe as we know it, will cease to exist, and there will be a resurrection, and there will be a judgment, and those who are ultimately good will go and reside in heaven for all eternity, and those who are ultimately evil will go and reside in hell for all eternity. All Muslims, Sunni and Shia, believe this. There are minor differences on details, but those differences are nothing like the differences between, let's say, the Catholics and the Protestants and the Orthodox Christians. So this ritual life of Muslims is very, very similar and uniform. And it is very much a kind of unifying element. Daniel Brown talks about this. He specifically gives the example of the call to prayer. So when it's time to pray, they don't ring a bell in the mosque or something like this, what you find in churches. And in Muslim countries, you can hear this outside, most in America, except for certain places like in Dearborn, Michigan, where they have a majority Muslim population, I think, in certain parts of the town, parts of the city. The adhan, or the call to prayer, is not broadcast outside, but in Muslim countries it is. So the people are called to the prayer by the human voice. And the person who calls out the prayer, again, that's done in Arabic. He calls out, God is most great 4 times. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And then there are other phrases, and they're written in the book here and translated by Daniel Brown. And again, there are some slight differences between the Sunni and the Shia call to prayer, but for the most part, it sounds exactly the same, and every Muslim would recognize it and wouldn't consider it unusual. Mosques also have very similar architectural form. Now, it's true that if you take a mosque in Isfahan built in the Safavid period and compare it to a mosque in Beijing, China, or compare it to a mosque, let's say, in Istanbul, you will find differences, but they all essentially have the same thing. Almost every mosque, except in the West, because of zoning laws and various other things, you have a minaret. You usually have a dome, but it's not necessary. A minaret is where, in old times, a person would go all the way up. It's like a tower, and he would stand up there because there weren't microphones, right? And he would call out the adhan. Now almost nobody does that. They just have these big mics and so forth. And when you come into a mosque, it's empty. There's no chairs or anything. There's just a vast open space, and Muslims line up in rows and pray facing in the direction of Mecca. And there's almost always some sort of architectural feature like an indentation or a niche in the wall that indicates the direction to Mecca. So that's very different than if you walked into, let's say, some sort of a Protestant church in El Paso, Texas, or if you walked into a Catholic church in Brazil somewhere, or a Serbian church in Serbia. It would be very, very different. So you don't have this in the Islamic world. All right, so I think we're more or less done here. I would have a brief request that I would like each of you to send me a brief email with your name and just write a brief description of yourself. Just say a bit about yourself and why you are interested in this course. It doesn't have to be long, just a few sentences. I would say a maximum, 100, 150 words. That's even probably too much. Just so I understand, what it is you're trying to get out of the course. For my own part, I've already introduced myself in my email, which I sent out to you, and I've already talked about my qualifications and so forth. So please refer to that email. Again, if you have any questions, do feel free to contact me. And I think we'll stop here, and I'll see you in next lecture. Thank you very much.